I did not expect this game to be nearly as good as it is. It's one I've been following since they've announced it, following their socials for updates and such, and while I dug what I saw and was already sold on it, in my mind, this was something that I would have saved for later, far after launch. Partly because there's so many games, so little time, and you can only buy so many, and so this was a lower priority for me. But thankfully, it dropped day and date on Game Pass, giving me more of a reason to try it. And I'm so glad I did. Because, as I said, I didn't expect to love it nearly as much as I do, even knowing it was something like Breath of the Wild meets Shadow of the Colossus and Dragon's Dogma. I guess it's because I expected it to be a good game that implements both, but didn't really think that it would particularly excel at either. Sort of thought it would be a jack of all trades, master of none situation. And I couldn't be more wrong. I also figured that even if they did nail the gameplay, I figured I probably wouldn't be sold on the story. But if you've been following me for any length of time, you know how important story is to me. And so, if a game is lacking in a good plot, I may enjoy the gameplay, but there's a good chance I might drop it in a few hours, unless the gameplay is really just that incredible. Usually only when it's a game where the gameplay is more important. But no, the story here is actually really well written. I didn't expect it at all, and maybe it's because I hadn't seen much of it in their marketing, but either way, pleasantly surprised. The world, the characters, the art style, all heavily reminds me of The Legend of Vox Machina, and even the way the characters speak and how the dialogue is written, it feels very reminiscent of that. The dialogue also reminds me of Hades, in both the way in which the characters speak and its design. And while it's not absolutely perfect and doesn't have to be the absolute best writing ever, it definitely did fill a narrative hole that I've been missing from a new fantasy RPG for quite some time. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Dragon Age. Speaking of, Alex Jordan, one of the many voices of Rook in Veilguard and the voice of Mr. Hans in Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, plays a pretty large role in this game as well. But seriously, I really did enjoy the dialogue and the writing and the way that the plot moved forward as I would go on runs to collect a bunch of crafting materials and or hunt some monsters. Yeah, I got my Monster Hunter fill without needing to buy the new Monster Hunter.
I don't need it. I need it!
Okay, it quelled it for a while, for now. This game is going to be one of those games that flies under your radar, one of those hidden gems that release every now and again. And if there's one thing I can recommend, it's to not skip this. I'm about 45 hours into Eternal Strands at the time of writing, so no, I haven't completed it yet, since I'd been hopping back and forth between a few other games I plan to review soon. Like a Dragon Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii is of course going to have a soft spot for me since I've been following the series for a while now, but while playing Avowed, albeit on top of its own reasons, I kept thinking about when I could go back to Eternal Strands. Yeah, that's how much it's got its hooks in me. Not many games capture my attention like they used to. Not because I'm part of a crowd that thinks gaming isn't fun anymore, but because when you play as many games as I do, you become increasingly more critical and burn out faster with the games that feel too alike. Games that make you feel like you've played it before. I'm not saying that we need to reinvent the wheel with every new game, but it's nice when we can add a unique angle or find a way to blend some of the best elements of other games that you love. And this is a perfect example. I compared this to Shadow of the Colossus, Dragon's Dogma, and Monster Hunter. Ironically, however, none of them were able to gauge my attention for very long. They're not bad games by any means, mind you. They're incredible, in fact. But I think that those elements married with the story, the characters, and the magic is what is really able to set itself apart. Apart enough for me to keep wanting to come back. Obviously, it really depends on you and the games that you like, and something like Monster Hunter could scratch that itch. I know it has been with my friends. They're absolutely hooked on Wilds. But for me, personally, previous Monster Hunters never really held my interest long enough, and maybe it's because I played it alone, and maybe Wilds is just that much better, but it allows me to get a taste of Monster Hunter without shelling out another $90 at the moment. And more importantly, this game just came at the right time. Eternal Strands follows Brynn, a warrior who recently joined an order called the Weavers. They wield magic abilities called Strands to manipulate their environment, be it with ice, fire, or gravity. She and her band embark on a journey into the Enclave, a once thriving land now cut off by a mysterious barrier. The world outside is in turmoil because of this event, and Brynn, now appointed as a new point, must uncover the truth behind the Enclave's isolation while battling massive creatures, navigating harsh landscapes, and using elemental magic to survive. As she delves deeper, she encounters remnants of the civilization that once lived there, as well as dangerous constructs, all while racing to prevent a looming catastrophe. And that's the basic premise of the game. I could delve into it even further, but I really do recommend going to the story blind because it's surprisingly good, and I recommend that you see it through. I say this is a lot like Monster Hunter than I should let on, because while it certainly is like Monster Hunter in a lot of ways, namely the epic hunts, you'll spend a majority of your time scavenging for loot as you traverse through each area. Of course, you can still do as many epic hunts as you like, as they always respawn in different locations, and you still do need to do them from time to time to fulfill certain quests, but it isn't what largely makes up the duration of your playthrough. Most of it is about scavenging and collecting as much loot as possible, or as much as you can fit in your satchel, to then return back to your little base to craft and or upgrade either weapons or armor, or upgrade each workstation, so long as you return alive. If you don't return alive, Oria, the bird lady, the former point, will send you back to the nearest loom gate in that area. Loom gates, by the way, are your fast travel points that allow you to visit several different locations and opposing loom gates in the same location, so long as you open them up. But back on track. Unfortunately, if you die, it means that you must discard most of your loot, except for a few of your choosing to start. That's where upgrading the workstations come in. They provide things like extra potion bonuses, you start with 3, more schematics, or increasing your inventory space, and what you can hold when you're revived by Oria, to name a few. I'd recommend saving your more valuable materials for your weapons and armor, and use some more common materials to upgrade their benches. Maybe go on a supply run or two, just to collect them, because it'll come in handy as the game goes on. Future you will thank you. Some schematics can also be found while scouring a location, just as the codex pages that need to be compiled when visiting Lane. But yes, most quests will require you to basically collect a particular set of codex pages, or a specific rare material, or something or another. But that's kind of what I like about this game. It gives you so much to explore almost at your leisure, without it seeming too overwhelmingly big like actual open world games are. The idea of hub worlds makes it feel a bit more worth exploring, especially when you make this into a very core part of the game. I also both love and hate the implementation of the weather system. No, I phrased that wrong. I mean, I love to hate it, because it offers a greater challenge when you've got a certain number of quests that you want to complete during that run, but then you realize that the place is plagued by miasma or freezing, for example. That's where you decide to either be bold and risky and hope you can withstand and evade these conditions, or you could wait until the next day or night cycles. Yes, it has a pseudo-calendar system that counts the days. Now, I'm not sure if that actually has any bearing within the story and if you're actually losing time, or if it's all just to increase the pressure, I'm not sure. But it's not something that I'd ever feel comfortable enough to find out. But why does it matter when I'm having so much fun exploring every nook and cranny? No, seriously, sure, it can be a little stressful to properly strategize which locations to visit and what you need from each one, but this game is one of the many games that I like to vibe out with while listening to a podcast. Of course, when a cutscene is shown, I'm more focused, but when I'm just out hunting or doing a supply run, it can be really a lot of fun. When you're out on the field, you'll be able to switch between 3 fighting styles: giant heavy sword, bow and arrow, and the good old sword and board. Most of the time, that's what you'll be using, as it's obviously the most balanced. It deals swift attacks while adding some protection, and more importantly, allowing for greater mobility. Your bow can do that too, but of course you're not going to get as many effective hits when you're close range, which most of the time you will be, especially when you're scaling up one of those great bows. But it's important to know when and where to switch between the 3 playstyles, because you will definitely need them all. I found that the giant sword though was mostly effective against mining boulders and destroying nests. But your weapons aren't the only tools at your disposal. The biggest pull for this game are weaving abilities called Strands. As you progress through the game, you're able to collect more schematics and materials, usually gathered from the epic hunts, and then give them to Dom, increasing your abilities. As I mentioned, it's the ability to use ice, fire, or telekinesis, and being able to swap between them on the fly that really adds that extra level of engagement. It's a secret sauce that sets it apart from just any monster hunter. Because when you're doing an epic hunt, for example, you'll need to be able to parse which ability will be most effective against it. Maybe you're fighting an Ash Peak Drake. You could just freeze its mouth before it breathes any more fire and sets you and everything ablaze. Or maybe you're up against a Highland Ice Claw, to which you'll notice that it won't stay still for long enough. That's when you need to focus damage on its wings instead, to then be able to finally collect its strand, which will be easier if you've donned the appropriate gear. These strands can be granted access if you've read and properly studied the codex about that particular great foe and learn how to apply it. Once you do, a giant orb appears somewhere on them, which you can then pull to harvest and then use to harness more abilities. These abilities will give you a greater range of tools that could be more or less effective, given the type. So for example, maybe you want to trap your enemy and just keep them in place while you swing at them. Then select Ice Wall. Or maybe perhaps you just want to deal a greater AoE that's more concentrated. Then you switch to Frost Mine instead. Or maybe you just want to burn through something without sending a Molten Barrage. Then you can use Drake's Breath. Note, you aren't actually going to have all these abilities from the start, but the more that you progress, the more that you'll eventually gain, making you an incredibly skilled and well-rounded fighter. These elements aren't just tied to your abilities though. By this I mean, every time you're about to go on another run, you need to check the weather in that particular location and see if you're fit to go. That's where building the different armor sets comes in. You visit Sola for her to either craft, reforge, upgrade, or dismantle your equipment, and then visit Casman's Caravan to change your equipment so that you're outfitted appropriately for that environment. I really do think it's clever how they decided to go with the approach of having to collect supplies to build your equipment instead of buying it outright, because most people would take the path of less resistance, which I'll admit, I'm guilty of too. And something like this was actually mentioned by studio head Mike Laidlaw, who previously worked on BioWare games, during a special Play Watch Listen episode from Alana Pierce. Austin Wintory, of course, who is also on the podcast regularly, actually scored this very game too. He scored some other games that you're probably familiar with, like Journey, Abzu, Assassin's Creed Syndicate, The Pathless, and more recently, Stray Gods, the role-playing musical. He, as always, crafted a very compelling score that really complements the tone of the game, but that's no surprise, he never misses. The three of them actually had a very interesting conversation, and if you're interested in listening to it, the link is down below. At a certain point, while you're out traversing, gathering supplies, or slaying monsters, you're bound to get bogged down by some of the recurring enemies. And that's when you realize you don't have to fight them. Instead, you could just use your telekinesis, pick them up, and yeet them off the map. I know I sure did. Sure, you won't get their drops, but by that stage, what they drop usually isn't as valuable as your time. And that's what makes this game so brilliant. It reinforces the game's greatest strength: player freedom. You're not shackled to a rigid set of mechanics. Instead, the game encourages experimentation, letting you carve out your own path through this world. Though, even with its occasional combat frustrations, Eternal Strands never lost my interest. The feeling of taking on towering enemies, breaking their armor, and weaving magic into every battle kept things engaging, even when some of the mechanics felt a little rough around the edges. It's a game that thrives on spectacle and player creativity, rewarding those who adapt and experiment. That spectacle isn't just in the gameplay though. Eternal Strands is a stunning game. Its art direction leans into a painterly D&D-esque style that also kind of reminds me of Immortals Phoenix Rising from a few years ago, that still gives its world a distinct identity. Environments feel vast and mythical, with floating islands, crumbling ruins, and dynamic weather that makes every battle backdrop feel cinematic, and adding a layer of strategy and unique approach. This kind of design isn't just refreshing, it's a testament to the vision of Yellow Brick Games. And considering this is their debut title, that's damn right impressive. It's not perfect, few games ever are, but for a first outing, they've absolutely nailed it, and Eternal Strands is absolutely worth checking out.